The snow fell over the dense forests of Vermont with a relentless, suffocating quiet, burying the dirt tracks and sealing the world outside in a shroud of frozen isolation. Inside the secluded wooden cabin that I had bled my entire life savings to buy, the air was just as freezing, though the thermometer on the wall read a deceptive 70 degrees. I stood by the kitchen island, wiping down the mahogany surface for the third time, my fingers numb not from the cold of the room, but from the bone-deep chill of utter rejection. This cabin was supposed to be our sanctuary, the ultimate refuge for a patched-together American family trying to find peace away from the crushing noise of Boston. Instead, it had transformed into a psychological torture chamber, and I was cast in the role of the live-in servant, paying rent with my dignity, my savings, and my fading sanity. My wife, Sarah, sat at the dining table with a steaming mug of imported cinnamon tea, looking every bit the picture of domestic perfection. To the outside world, the PTA members, the local church committee, the neighbors 3 miles down the winding ridge road, Sarah was a saint. She possessed that rare, effortless suburban elegance, soft blonde hair tied back in a loose, graceful knot, gentle hazel eyes that seemed to overflow with empathy, and a warm, melodic voice that could disarm a judge. But the moment the heavy oak front door clicked shut and bolted against the howling winter wind, the mask vanished. The gentle mother and devoted wife dissolved into thin air, leaving behind a chilling stranger with eyes like shards of winter ice. Across from her sat David and Chloe, her 2 children from her previous marriage, whom I had legally adopted and raised as my own for the past 5 years. They were glued to their high-end smartphones, their thumbs flying across screens while their plates sat untouched. They didn't look at me when I entered the room. They never did. To them, I wasn't a father, a provider, or even a man of any substance. I was an intrusive species, a pathetic, middle-aged phantom haunting their hallways, tolerated only because my credit score had financed the roof over their heads. "The floor by the mudroom is tracking slush again, Thomas," Sarah said, her voice devoid of any inflection, not even bothering to lift her gaze from the financial portfolio spread across the table. "I thought I asked you to lay down the heavy-duty rubber mats before the storm hit. Or is following a simple instruction beyond your cognitive capabilities these days?" The words were delivered with a casual, devastating cruelty that cut deeper than any shout. It wasn't anger. It was pure, unadulterated contempt. It was the tone one might use toward a stray dog that kept tracking mud onto a freshly cleaned rug, a nuisance to be managed, nothing more. "I'm sorry, Sarah," I replied, my voice sounding hollow and small, even to my own ears. "The hardware store in town was closed early because of the blizzard warning. I'll clear it out first thing in the morning." "Naturally," David muttered under his breath, not looking up from his game. "Excuses. It's always some pathetic excuse with him. If he put half the effort into being useful as he does into whining, maybe we wouldn't live in the middle of nowhere." Chloe snickered, a sharp, metallic sound that bounced off the vaulted wooden ceilings. "Don't be mean to him, David. He worked so hard to buy us this shack, remember? He told us it was our forever home. Too bad forever feels like a life sentence in a minimum security prison." They shared a synchronized, knowing smirk, a look that I had seen pass between the 3 of them hundreds of times over the past year. It was an exclusive club, a tight-knit alliance built on shared inside jokes, secret glances, and a mutual disdain directed entirely at me. I stood frozen by the counter, gripping the edge of the polished wood so hard my knuckles turned white. Just 6 years ago, when Sarah and I first met in Boston, she had looked at me like I hung the stars in the sky. Back then, I was a senior financial consultant with a flourishing career, a respectable brownstone, and a future full of promise. But step by step, subtle decision by subtle decision, my life had been dismantled. I had liquidated my retirement fund, sold my ancestral home, and poured every single liquid asset I possessed into purchasing this isolated Vermont timber lodge under joint survivorship rights, a decision Sarah had passionately argued for under the guise of protecting our family's future. I was a prisoner in the very fortress I had financed. "Dinner is ready," I announced quietly, keeping my head bowed to avoid meeting their eyes. I had spent 3 hours roasting the free-range turkey, preparing the cranberry reduction from scratch, and baking the sweet potato casserole just the way Sarah liked it. "Put mine in Tupperware," Sarah said dismissively, flipping a page in her portfolio. "I have a conference call with the regional bank executives in 10 minutes. And clean up this kitchen before you go to sleep. The grease from the roasting pan smells atrocious." I don't know how someone of your background can be so utterly incapable of maintaining basic hygiene. Without waiting for a response, she gathered her papers and glided up the wide oak staircase, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian runner that I had bought for her on our second anniversary. David and Chloe didn't even bother to take a plate. They grabbed 2 cans of imported craft soda from the stainless steel refrigerator, shoved past me in the narrow doorway without a word of acknowledgement, and stomped up to the second-floor media room, slamming the door behind them so hard that the mounted elk antlers on the living room wall shuddered. I was left alone in the vast, brightly lit kitchen, surrounded by the rich, savory aromas of a feast that no one intended to share with me. The silence of the Vermont wilderness rushed back in to fill the void, heavier and more menacing than before. Outside, the wind howled through the towering pines, whipping the heavy snowdrifts against the triple-paned glass windows like icy fingernails scratching for a way inside. This was my life now. Days spent running endless errands, cleaning up after people who despised my existence, and enduring a constant, low-grade psychological warfare designed to make me question my own grip on reality. I sat down at the edge of the massive dining table, pulling a single cold dinner roll toward me. My hands trembled slightly. Over the past few months, the psychological strain had begun manifesting physically. I suffered from chronic insomnia, erratic heart palpitations, and a lingering brain fog that made it difficult to concentrate on even the simplest tasks. Sarah was always so attentive, regularly handing me vitamin supplements and custom-blended herbal teas to help me sleep through the night. "You look so stressed, darling. Your nerves are frayed," she would whisper soothingly, kissing my forehead with lips that felt as cold as stone. "Drink this. It will clear your head." My eyes wandered around the sprawling, rustic-chic dining room. The exposed cedar beams, the handcrafted stone fireplace, the imported leather furniture. Every single square inch of this magnificent structure was paid for by the liquidation of my independent life. When we moved here, Sarah had insisted that managing the finances of a remote property was too stressful for me, given my recent career burnout. She had gently taken over the administration of our joint accounts, the mortgage payments, and the insurance portfolios. I had handed over the reins willingly, blinded by love, exhaustion, and a desperate desire to be a good husband. A sudden sharp metallic clink from the hallway startled me. I froze, listening intently. The house was supposed to be completely sealed for the night. The kids were upstairs in the media room. Sarah was on her international conference call in the primary suite above. Yet I distinctly heard the faint metallic scrape of the cellar door latch downstairs, the heavy oak door that led from the lower-level utility room out to the snow-covered backyard. My heart skipped a beat. Nobody went outside in the middle of a Vermont blizzard unless they had a compelling clandestine reason. Moving slowly, my footsteps muffled by the thick wool socks I wore, I crept out of the dining room and slipped into the dim hallway. The air grew noticeably colder as I descended the back staircase toward the semi-finished basement and the utility storage rooms. The house creaked and groaned under the fierce pressure of the gale winds outside, the wooden beams shifting and settling in the freezing dark. I reached the bottom of the stairs, pressing my back against the pine-paneled wall. The utility room door was ajar by an inch, casting a thin, pale strip of yellow light across the concrete floor. From inside came the low, muffled murmur of a hushed conversation, a voice that definitely did not belong to Sarah, David, or Chloe. My breath caught in my throat, my blood ran cold. I inched closer, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, pressing my ear against the cracked wooden frame. "Are you out of your mind meeting me here tonight?" A low, gravelly male voice whispered fiercely, dripping with suppressed panic. "The old man could have walked down at any second." "Relax, Richard," Sarah's voice replied, smooth, confident, and completely devoid of the icy harshness she used on me upstairs. In fact, it sounded warm, intimate, and chillingly familiar. Thomas is downstairs in the kitchen drowning in his own misery. He's completely neutralized. The sedative I put in his evening tea has got him seeing ghosts by now. He wouldn't notice a freight train barreling through the living room. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. Richard. The name echoed in my brain like a gunshot. Richard Vance. My former business associate and supposedly my closest, most loyal confidant from my days in Boston. The man who had supposedly moved to Chicago 2 years ago for a corporate merger. The man I still called every single week to vent my marital frustrations. The man who offered me sympathetic advice over encrypted messaging apps while I wept over my failing marriage. Did you finish transferring the secondary tranche from the offshore account? Richard's voice murmured, accompanied by the distinct rustle of heavy winter coats and the sound of someone brushing snow off their boots. If the federal auditors in New York trace the credit union deposits back to the Vermont Holding LLC, we're both looking at federal penitentiary time. Your husband's signature on the primary liability waiver won't protect us forever if the compliance software flags the IP logs. Stop panicking, Sarah scoffed softly, and I heard the unmistakable sound of skin against skin, a gentle, affectionate caress, followed by the soft rustle of an embrace. Thomas signed every single liability waiver 6 months ago under the pretense of estate tax restructuring. Legally, investigation blows open, the SEC and the FBI will come down on him, not us. He'll take the fall for every single cent we drained from the municipal credit union in Boston. By the time he realizes he's legally culpable for grand larceny and bank fraud, we'll already be in the Caymans. And the kids? Richard asked, his voice whisper. Chloe and David are playing their parts well, but teenagers can be sloppy. What if the boy slips up? They hate him just as much as I do, Sarah replied, a dark, venomous amusement lacing her tone. They love the lifestyle, and they know who holds the purse strings. Thomas thinks he's rescuing a broken family. In reality, he walked straight into a slaughterhouse with a neon sign pointing at his own neck. I stood paralyzed in the dark hallway, the world spinning violently off its axis. Every single drop of blood seemed to drain from my face. The house around me, the cozy wooden cabin, the roaring fireplace, the snow-covered pines, suddenly morphed into a grotesque, twisted illusion. Sarah wasn't my loving wife. She was the mastermind of a multi-million-dollar financial embezzlement ring operating out of the Boston banking sector. David and Chloe weren't just ungrateful stepchildren. They were active, willing accomplices in an elaborate legal trap designed to frame me for financial crimes I had never committed. And Richard, my brother-in-arms, my trusted confidant, the man I confided my deepest insecurities to every single night, was her partner in crime, her lover, and the shadow orchestrating my systematic destruction. My mind raced back across the past 5 years, replaying every argument, every signature, every prescription bottle, and every cold glance with terrifying, crystal-clear clarity. The puzzle pieces clicked into place with a sickening, definitive snap. I wasn't an aging, broken-down husband failing his family. I was a target, a carefully selected patsy chosen for my clean credit history, my quiet nature, and my deep reservoir of financial assets. Down in the utility room, the hushed murmurs continued, punctuated by the soft, sickening sound of laughter, shared laughter between a wife and a treacherous best friend mocking my utter stupidity beneath the very roof I had paid for with my sweat and blood. A profound, absolute silence settled over my chest. The wave of panic, confusion, and heart-wrenching betrayal that had threatened to crush me seconds ago suddenly evaporated, replaced by something far colder, far heavier, and infinitely more dangerous. The grief vanished. The weakness dissolved. In its place, a sharp, unyielding resolve took root in my veins. They thought they had trapped a lamb in the middle of a frozen wasteland. They had no idea they had just locked themselves in a cage with a wolf who had decided to stop playing victim. Slowly, deliberately, I stepped back from the cellar door, letting my rubber-soled boot make the faintest scuff against the hardwood floor. Inside the utility room, the voices abruptly cut off. "Did you hear that?" Richard whispered sharply. "It's just the wind settling the framing," Sarah replied dismissively. "Thomas is upstairs eating his roll like a good little dog. Let's go up to the master suite." We have plenty of details to finalize before Thanksgiving dinner tomorrow. I turned around in the pitch darkness, my jaw set like iron. I didn't return to the kitchen. I climbed the stairs back toward my lonely, freezing guest bedroom, the room they had forced me into 3 months ago under the excuse of my chronic snoring. Sitting down on the edge of the unmade bed, I pulled a heavy waterproof pelican case out from underneath the floorboards beneath the closet lining. I popped the heavy brass latches. Inside, illuminated by the pale blue glow of my encrypted satellite phone, sat a stack of certified digital backups, forensic bank routing logs, encrypted audio recordings of their previous secret meetings over the last 8 months, and an official federal witness protection dossier bearing my real name, my real rank, and my actual department insignia. The trap was fully set, but it wasn't sprung on me. Tomorrow was Thanksgiving, and I had prepared a feast of my own that none of them would ever forget. The storm outside didn't just howl, it screamed, hurling dense sheets of heavy New England ice against the triple-paned glass of the cabin, threatening to shatter the illusion of warmth and safety that the rustic timbers tried so hard to project. Inside my makeshift sanctuary, the cold, austere guest bedroom at the far end of the second-floor corridor, the digital clock on the nightstand glared with the harsh red numbers of 2:14 a.m. I sat cross-legged on the bare mattress, the glow of my encrypted laptop screen cutting sharp, ghostly lines across my face. The pelican case lay open beside me, its contents spilling out onto the coarse wool blanket like pieces of a macabre jigsaw puzzle. For the past 6 months, while Sarah, David, and Chloe thought they were slowly breaking my spirit, turning me into a stuttering, sleep-deprived ghost of a man, I had been methodically dismantling the architectural framework of their grand deception. Chapter 2 of their meticulous masterpiece wasn't written in ink. It was written in the cold, unyielding language of federal debt and legal servitude. It had all started 18 months ago, right after we packed up our comfortable lives in Boston and relocated to this isolated stretch of Vermont wilderness. At the time, Sarah had played the role of the devoted, financially pragmatic wife to absolute perfection. "Thomas, darling," she had purred one evening while pouring me a glass of Merlot as we sat by the newly installed fieldstone fireplace. "Living out here in the sticks is a dream, but the municipal tax laws are an absolute nightmare. Between your old corporate accounts and my position at the regional credit union, we need to streamline our assets. If we don't restructure our holdings under a unified family trust, the state of Vermont will bleed us dry in property and inheritance taxes." At the time, I was exhausted. Burned out from a grueling corporate restructuring battle in Boston that had left my nerves frayed and my confidence shaken, I trusted her implicitly. Sarah wasn't just my wife. She was a senior compliance officer and assistant vice president of credit operations at one of New England's most respected lending institutions. To me, her word on financial matters was gospel. I handed over my power of attorney, signed blanket authorization forms for asset consolidation, and willingly transferred the deeds of my premarital properties into the newly minted Verde Pines Family LLC. I had thought I was building a fortress for our future. In reality, I was voluntarily handing them the architectural blueprints to my own prison. The first subtle warning sign had materialized 4 months ago, arriving quietly in the form of a thick, cream-colored envelope slipped among the junk mail and utility bills. It was a standard delinquency notice from a commercial lending firm in Boston, a firm I had never done business with in my life. It cited an overdue balance of $42,000 on a revolving line of credit tied to an industrial equipment lease in my name. When I brought the letter to Sarah, her reaction should have sent me running for the hills. She hadn't looked surprised, confused, or concerned. Instead, her hazel eyes had narrowed into cold, calculating slits of ice. With a chillingly practiced nonchalance, she had snatched the paper from my fingers, tossed it casually into the recycling bin, and flashed me that disarming, angelic smile that had trapped me from the day we met. "Oh, don't be such a paranoid worrywart, Thomas," she had laughed softly, walking over to wrap her arms around my neck, her perfume masking the underlying scent of deceit. "It's just a clerical error by the bank's new automated compliance software. Thousands of accounts got mixed up during the recent regional merger. I'll clear it up with the compliance department tomorrow on my lunch break. You know how these modern banking algorithms are, completely incompetent. And like a blind, obedient fool, I had accepted her explanation. I let it go. I kissed her cheek, apologized for my anxiety, and buried my head back in the sand. I didn't realize until much later that the recycling bin had been emptied within 10 minutes, and that the clerical error was actually the first drop of rain in a coming financial monsoon. As I sat in the dark of the guest room, staring at the raw data displayed on my laptop screen, the full scope of the trap snapped into devastating focus. I pulled up the digitized corporate registry records of the Verde Pines LLC, cross-referencing them with the personal credit reports I had secretly pulled through a secure backdoor channel using my old federal credentials. The numbers didn't just lie, they screamed bloody murder. There was no clerical error. Over the past 3 years, Sarah had systematically leveraged every single asset I owned to secure massive, high-interest commercial loans and lines of credit. My ancestral home in Massachusetts? Sold off under a forged signature. While I was recovering from minor outpatient surgery, the proceeds funneled directly into a shell account in the Cayman Islands. My private retirement portfolio, liquidated down to the last penny and redirected to service corporate debt held by a phantom construction firm that didn't even exist outside a P.O. box in Providence. Worse still, my name was attached as the sole managing director and primary guarantor to more than $1.4 million in unsecured commercial debt. Legally, civilly, and criminally, I was the sole owner, the sole beneficiary, and the sole perpetrator of a massive financial fraud scheme that had siphoned millions from the Boston Credit Union where Sarah worked. If the federal regulators or the Internal Audit Division ever blew the lid off the operation, and based on my surveillance, the SEC was already sniffing around the margins, Sarah and her co-conspirators would walk away clean, protected by layers of corporate insulation and forged liability waivers. Meanwhile, I would be strapped into an orange jumpsuit, facing a mandatory 25-year federal penitentiary sentence for white-collar crimes I didn't even know were being committed in my name. A soft, metallic click echoed down the upstairs hallway, cutting sharply through the steady roar of the blizzard outside. I froze instantly, my hand sliding off the laptop trackpad and closing instinctively around the heavy aluminum casing of a specialized encrypted data drive. The floorboards in the hallway groaned, a distinct measured creak that I had learned to identify over months of living under surveillance. It wasn't the heavy, clumsy stride of a teenager sneaking back into their room after midnight. It was the light, purposeful step of someone wearing soft-soled slippers, moving with malicious intent. I killed the laptop screen, plunging the room into absolute darkness, and slid silently off the mattress, pressing my back flat against the cold timber wall beside the door. The doorknob of the guest room didn't rattle. It turned with agonizing slowness, the internal latch sliding back with barely a whisper. A thin sliver of yellow hallway light sliced across the dark hardwood floor, expanding as the door crept open an inch, then two. A shadow fell across the threshold. I couldn't see the face, but I could smell the faint, expensive scent of French lavender combined with the sterile metallic chill of the winter night. Sarah. She didn't step inside. She stood in the doorway for a long, agonizing moment, her breathing steady and controlled, listening intently to the rhythm of the room. I regulated my breathing, forcing my chest to rise and fall in the slow, heavy cadence of a man deep in a chemically induced slumber, the very slumber her custom-blended evening teas were designed to guarantee. "Thomas?" she whispered into the dark, her voice carrying a chillingly sweet, mocking cadence that sent a fresh spike of adrenaline through my veins. I didn't move a muscle. I didn't make a sound. After a tense 10 seconds, she shifted slightly, and I heard the faint rustle of heavy paper. A moment later, something slid underneath the gap of the wooden door, whispering softly across the floorboards until it came to rest against my boot. Withdrew her shadow. The door clicked shut with the same ghostly silence with which it had opened, and the retreating footsteps faded down the corridor toward the master suite. I waited 3 full minutes, my heart hammering like a trapped piston against my ribs, before sliding down to the floor to retrieve whatever she had left behind. I crept back toward the window, letting the pale blue light of the snowy night bleed through the glass, and unfolded the heavy piece of parchment. It wasn't a love note. It wasn't an apology. It was a legal document, a multi-page property transfer and debt assumption agreement, drafted with terrifying precision by a high-priced corporate law firm in Boston. The terms were brutally simple. Within 72 hours, specifically set for the morning after Thanksgiving, I was to sign over all remaining residual rights to the Vermont cabin, relinquish any claim to our shared banking assets, and formally accept full, unilateral liability for the entirety of the corporate debt currently resting on the Verde Pines LLC ledger. At the bottom of the page, where the signature line awaited my ink, Sarah had already helpfully attached a sticky note in her immaculate, looping cursive. "Sign it, Thomas. Don't make this uglier than it has to be. You're already a ghost in the eyes of the law. Let's keep it that way for the kids' sake." For the kids' sake. A dark, humorless laugh rose from the back of my throat, tasting like copper and ash. The kids. If Sarah was the mastermind orchestrating the grand financial execution, David and Chloe were the vicious little executioners tasked with tightening the noose around my neck on a daily basis. I walked back to the edge of the bed and pulled up a secondary folder on my encrypted laptop, clicking open a series of hidden video files recorded by the micro cameras I had secretly installed behind the living room molding 3 months ago. The footage began to play in total silence, the playback speed cranked up to double time. On the screen, I watched myself leave the cabin early one morning to pick up supplies in town. The moment my truck disappeared down the snow-choked driveway, the dynamic inside the house underwent a radical, sickening transformation. David, 18 years old and built like a collegiate linebacker, slammed his video game controller onto the coffee table with a vicious curse, kicking over the end table I had spent an entire weekend hand-carving. Chloe, 17, strolled over to the kitchen counter, casually opened my private desk drawer where I kept my notary stamps and personal correspondence, and pulled out a stack of blank stationery bearing my signature. "God, I hate the way he breathes in this house," David sneered on the footage, his voice captured with startling clarity by the high-gain directional mic. "Every time he looks at me with those pathetic puppy dog eyes, I feel like punching his teeth down his throat. When is Mom going to finally get him to sign the rest of these property waivers so we can sell this dump and move back to Miami?" "Relax, big brother," Chloe replied, laughing coldly as she practiced forging my signature onto the bottom of a commercial tax document with practiced, chilling ease. "Mom says the trap is almost completely shut. Once he signs the Thanksgiving transfer papers tomorrow night, he won't just be broke. He'll be a fugitive wanted by the feds for grand larceny. We just have to keep playing our parts until then. Make him feel like garbage. Make him crawl. It's hilarious watching him try to cook for us like an obedient little house pet." The video looped, showing them high-fiving each other over the kitchen island, laughing hysterically at a joke whose punchline was my impending destruction. These weren't just ungrateful stepchildren whom I had failed to connect with. They were active, willing, sociopathic accomplices in a family conspiracy designed to drain my blood, steal my identity, and throw my broken body into the federal incinerator. They had spent years studying my handwriting, practicing my signature, planting false evidence in my home office, and laying out a complex web of legal landmines designed to ensure that if I ever tried to stand up for myself, I would detonate the entire explosive charge right in my own face. The second chapter of their grand design was built entirely on coercion, psychological gaslighting, and fabricated legal exposure. They believed they had completely cornered the market on deceit. They thought they were playing a game of chess where I was a blindfolded piece waiting to be sacrificed. They had no idea that I wasn't playing chess at all. I was playing a game of tactical demolition, and the detonator was sitting right in my hand. I picked up the legal document Sarah had slipped under my door, laid it flat across my desk, and pulled a heavy black marker from my pocket. Instead of signing my name on the dotted line, I drew a large, bold red X straight across the entire liability clause, then slid the paper neatly back into its folder. I walked over to the frost-covered window and peered out into the howling white abyss of the Vermont night. Far down the winding access road, nearly 2 miles from our property line, a faint amber beam of light cut through the falling snow. A pair of heavy-duty federal transport vehicles parked quietly off the shoulder, waiting for my signal. The trap was fully closed. But tomorrow, when we sat down around the dining room table for our festive Thanksgiving dinner, The floor beneath their feet was going to completely give way. The digital alarm clock on the nightstand clicked over to 3:45 a.m., casting a harsh crimson glow across the dark, austere confines of my guest bedroom. Outside, the Vermont blizzard had intensified into a howling white tempest, violently thrashing the heavy pine branches against the window panes as if demanding entrance. But inside my chest, the atmosphere was dead, cold, and unnervingly still. The psychological fog that had choked my cognitive functions for months, the constant low-grade brain drain induced by the custom herbal teas Sarah lovingly brewed for me every evening, had completely evaporated, burned away by the white-hot clarity of absolute betrayal. Chapter 3 of their grand design wasn't just a matter of domestic abuse or petty financial manipulation. It was the exposure of a massive, cold-blooded, white-collar criminal enterprise, and my own wife was sitting at the epicenter of the web as a ruthless spider. I sat back down at the edge of the unmade bed, opening the secure, encrypted partition of my laptop once more. The screen illuminated my face with a pale, steady blue light, revealing the dark circles under my eyes that had once been mistaken for natural exhaustion or age. My fingers danced across the mechanical keyboard with the sharp, rhythmic precision of a man who had spent 2 decades navigating the razor-thin margins of corporate finance and high-stakes federal investigations. Before I had met Sarah in Boston 6 years ago, before I allowed myself to be lulled into the quiet, suburban illusion of a second chance at family life, I hadn't just been a generic financial consultant. I had spent 12 grueling years as a senior forensic accountant, specializing in cross-border asset tracing and corporate fraud remediation for federal regulatory bodies. When Sarah and I first crossed paths at an elite charity gala in downtown Boston, she was the epitome of grace and professional achievement. She carried herself with the sharp, authoritative elegance of someone who understood the intricate gears of high finance. At the time, she was a rising star at one of New England's oldest and most prestigious regional credit unions, quickly climbing the corporate ladder to become the senior vice president of credit operations and risk compliance. To the banking board, she was a miracle worker, a meticulous compliance officer who could sniff out non-compliance and structural vulnerabilities before anyone else could even blink. To me, she was simply the woman who had somehow managed to stitch my fractured post-divorce life back together. When our relationship moved swiftly from whirlwind romance to marriage, I willingly stepped back from the grueling 80-hour work weeks of the corporate world, handing over the administrative reins of my personal wealth to her capable, trusted hands. I thought I was showing love, trust, and partnership. I didn't know I was handing the keys of my life straight to a professional grifter. Using my old back-channel credentials and a series of secure, decentralized proxy servers, I bypassed the standard commercial firewalls and accessed the internal server logs of the Boston Credit Union, where Sarah still technically maintained an executive office, even while working remotely from our Vermont retreat. The files I pulled down weren't ordinary bank statements. They were classified internal audit trails, transaction ledgers, and hidden compliance exception reports that normal auditors never saw. The data unspooled across my laptop screen with the chilling clarity of a horror movie plot. Sarah wasn't just managing loans. She was engineering a multi-million-dollar ghost asset pipeline. For over 4 years, while I was busy remodeling our homes, playing the supportive husband, and raising her teenage children, Sarah had been using my pristine, unblemished personal credit profile as a master skeleton key. She had established more than a dozen shell corporations, phantom entities registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands under forged articles of incorporation bearing my signature, notarized by corrupt contacts within the Boston banking district. Through these fictitious corporate conduits, she had systematically siphoned over $4.2 million from the credit union's commercial lending reserves, funneled the capital through complex layers of international wire transfers, and converted the fiat funds into high-grade digital assets and real estate holdings, including the very timber lodge in Vermont where I was currently sitting as a captive prisoner. The mechanics of her crime were as elegant as they were terrifying. Whenever the federal banking regulators or the internal compliance division flagged an irregularity in the credit union's regional ledger, Sarah's position as risk assessment director allowed her to intercept the audit flags. She would manually route the discrepancies through dummy accounts bearing my name, fabricating digital paper trails that made it look entirely as though I, Thomas Vance, the quiet, Semi-retired financial consultant, was the mastermind orchestrating a massive systematic credit fraud scheme from behind the scenes. I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat as a specific file header caught my attention. It was the master liability waiver, the foundational legal document that bound the entire fraudulent corporate structure together. My signature was stamped at the bottom of every single page. Except, as I zoomed in under high-resolution digital analysis, the truth became unmistakably clear. The strokes weren't mine. They were a microscopic, hyper-accurate digital tracing forged using a high-precision mechanical stylus, the very same stylus that Chloe used for her digital art projects down in the downstairs studio. My entire life, my reputation, my financial security, and my physical freedom had been completely hollowed out and replaced with a federal prison sentence, all packaged neatly into a legal coffin and signed off by the woman who shared my bed every night. A sudden sharp flash of white light illuminated the snowy woods outside my window, followed a split second later by a low subterranean rumble of thunder, a rare winter lightning storm rolling across the freezing ridges of Vermont. The weather outside matched the frozen tempest raging inside my mind. Every memory of our life together suddenly inverted itself, shedding its warm romantic veneer to reveal the cold predatory calculation underneath. I remembered our wedding day in Newport, Rhode Island. I remembered how Sarah had insisted on handling all the legal prenuptial documentation through her own hand-picked corporate legal team, claiming it would save us the hassle of dealing with outside firms. I remembered the way she had gently guided my hand to sign a stack of routine asset consolidation forms on our first wedding anniversary, pouring me a glass of expensive champagne to celebrate our financial unity. I remembered the countless times she had looked at me across the dinner table with those soft, angelic hazel eyes, whispering about how safe she felt knowing I was taking care of her and the kids. It had all been a lie, a meticulously rehearsed theatrical performance designed to keep the Mark calm, compliant, and completely unaware while the noose was being slowly tightened around his neck. And the cruelty of it wasn't just financial, it was psychological. She didn't just want my money, she wanted to obliterate my sense of reality. The chronic fatigue I had been suffering from for the past 8 months wasn't a natural byproduct of aging or burnout. I pulled up another hidden folder on my drive, a detailed medical analysis report that I had secretly run on a sample of the custom herbal evening tea Sarah had been administering to me every night like clockwork. The chemical breakdown was right there in black and white. Micro dosages of a synthetic, non-detectable neurosedative designed to induce chronic short-term memory loss, brain fog, emotional instability, and lethargy. For nearly a year, my own wife had been slowly, methodically poisoning my central nervous system to ensure that if I ever stumbled upon her financial paper trail, I wouldn't have the mental clarity or cognitive stamina to put the pieces together. A wave of intense, blinding fury surged through my veins, hot and heavy enough to melt the ice on the windows. For a fraction of a second, the primal urge to storm down the hallway, drag her out of her plush king-size bed, and demand an explanation roared in my ears. I wanted to shake her, to scream at her, to force her to look me in the eye and acknowledge the sheer, unadulterated evil of what she had done. Instead, I closed my eyes, took a long, measured breath, and let the anger drain away, replacing it with an absolute razor-sharp discipline. No. Rage was a luxury for people who weren't playing for keeps. If I exploded now, if I confronted her with half-baked accusations or emotional outbursts, she would simply activate her backup plan. Her high-priced corporate defense attorneys in Boston would instantly move to freeze my remaining assets, paint me as an unstable, paranoid lunatic suffering from severe cognitive decline, and have me locked away in a psychiatric facility before the sun rose over the Vermont peaks. The federal authorities would swoop in, arrest me on the forged grand larceny charges, and Sarah, David, Chloe, and her lover Richard would walk away scot-free into the sunset with millions of dollars of my life's work. The game wasn't about shouting matches anymore. It was about absolute total annihilation. I opened a fresh, encrypted communication window on my satellite laptop and typed out a brief, heavily encrypted data packet addressed directly to a secure routing node at the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division in Boston, marked with a Priority 1 executive override code that only a senior active status undercover asset possessed. Yes, my past wasn't just that of a corporate financial consultant or a civilian victim. 6 years ago, before I ever met Sarah at that charity gala, I had spent over a decade working deep-cover financial intelligence operations for federal regulatory task forces, tracking down international bank fraudsters, corporate cartels, and high-level white-collar syndicates. I had retired from active field operations to live a quiet, peaceful life in Boston. A quiet life that had made me soft, vulnerable, and an easy target for a professional predator who thought she had found the ultimate mark. Little did Sarah know, she hadn't trapped a broken, helpless sheep. She had accidentally walked into a cage with the very wolf tasked with hunting down apex predators like her. I attached the complete financial ledger, the forged digital signatures, the hidden surveillance footage of David and Chloe celebrating their scam, the toxicological reports of the neurosedative tea, and the exact coordinates of the Vermont cabin, where the entire syndicate would be gathered under one roof less than 24 hours from now. At the bottom of the transmission package, I added a single chilling instruction for the federal intervention team. Hold position outside the property perimeter until the designated signal is given tomorrow evening during the Thanksgiving dinner service. Do not move in early. Let them sit down at the table believing they've won. I hit the transmit key. The data bar flashed green, uploading the encrypted payload across the secure satellite relay in less than 3 seconds. The trap was locked, loaded, and primed for detonation. A soft, muffled sound from the hallway outside my bedroom door pulled me instantly out of my tactical focus. I killed the laptop screen, plunging the room back into pitch darkness, and slipped silently off the bed. I moved with the effortless, disciplined quiet of my old field days, pressing my back flat against the wall beside the heavy oak door. The floorboards creaked, once, twice, with a feather-light touch. Someone was standing right outside my threshold in the freezing hallway. I didn't hear the doorknob turn this time. Instead, a faint, rhythmic scratching sound brushed against the bottom of the door, followed by a soft, whispering voice that carried right through the wood grain. It wasn't Sarah. It was Chloe's voice, low, venomous, and dripping with a malicious teenage cruelty that chilled the marrow in my bones. "Just hold on for one more day, you pathetic old loser," the whispered voice hissed into the dark, accompanied by a soft, mocking giggle that faded away down the corridor. "Tomorrow night you're going to sign everything away, and then you're going away for a very, very long time. Enjoy your last night in our house." I stood in the absolute darkness of the guest room, a cold, humorless smile touching the corners of my mouth. They were counting down the hours until their victory. They were planning their escape routes to Miami, dreaming of the millions they were about to inherit over a festive holiday meal. Let them dream. Tomorrow was Thanksgiving, and I was going to serve them a feast they would never, ever forget. The digital alarm clock on the nightstand clicked over to 6:00 a.m., casting a harsh, pale blue light across the austere confines of my guest bedroom, as the howling Vermont wind continued to batter the exterior walls with unrelenting fury. Downstairs, the household was already waking up, though waking up in this house did not mean the warm, sleepy stretches of a normal family starting a holiday. It meant the systematic, synchronized activation of a psychological torture machine designed to grind my remaining resistance into fine, invisible dust before the grand finale later that evening. Chapter 4 of their meticulously engineered nightmare wasn't just about Sarah's financial embezzlement or the cold-blooded betrayal of a mastermind wife. It was about the chilling realization that the corruption had metastasized deep into the next generation. David and Chloe weren't merely collateral damage in a broken marriage or ungrateful stepchildren whining about their lifestyle. They were hardened, enthusiastic accomplices, vicious little foot soldiers who took sadistic, genuine pleasure in watching me squirm, doubt my own sanity, and apologize for crimes I never committed. I sat up on the edge of the unmade mattress, running my palms over my face to wipe away the lingering chemical numbness of the neurosedative tea Sarah had slipped into my mug the previous night. My mind was sharp, clear, and razor-focused, completely bypassing the groggy fog they expected me to wake up with. Today was Thanksgiving, the day they had chosen for my total annihilation, the day they planned to force my hand across a final, fatal legal document and cast me out into the frozen wilderness as a convicted felon. I stood up, straightened my clothes with meticulous care, and walked quietly down the second-floor hallway toward the kitchen, stepping lightly to avoid waking the sleeping giants of deceit. The aroma of freshly brewed artisanal coffee and cinnamon-spiced French toast hung heavy in the air, but the atmosphere in the sprawling kitchen was as frigid as the snowdrifts piling up against the back patio doors. Sarah stood by the marble island, her blonde hair pulled back into a sleek, severe ponytail, wearing an expensive cashmere sweater that screamed suburban perfection. At the kitchen table sat David and Chloe, already deep into their breakfast, scrolling through their phones with an air of arrogant entitlement that made my blood run cold. "Look who decided to crawl out of his cave," David muttered under his breath, not bothering to lift his eyes from his screen as I entered the room. A cruel, smug smirk played at the corners of his 18-year-old mouth. I thought for a second the cold up here finally stopped his heart. "It's almost sad how pathetic he looks in the morning," Chloe snickered, leaning back in her chair with a theatrical yawn. "Don't be mean, big brother. He needs his energy today. After all, he has a lot of heavy lifting to do, signing away everything he owns and packing his bags before our real guests arrive for dinner tonight. Right, Thomas?" She turned her gaze toward me, her eyes flashing with a predatory, chilling amusement that bore no resemblance to any teenager I had ever known. I kept my face completely blank, forcing my expression into the sheepish, defeated mask of a beaten, broken-down husband that they had spent the last 8 months constructing. I kept my shoulders slumped, my gaze lowered toward the hardwood floor, playing my assigned role to absolute perfection. "Good morning, Sarah," I murmured softly, letting a slight tremor enter my voice. Did you sleep well?" Sarah didn't look up from her coffee cup immediately. She took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the silence stretch out like a taut rubber band before turning her hazel eyes toward me. Those eyes, which once looked at me with simulated adoration, were now pools of glacial contempt. "I slept wonderfully, Thomas," she replied smoothly, her voice carrying that sweet, poison-laced cadence that used to make my stomach knot in anxiety. "Unlike you, apparently. You look like absolute hell. Are you still having those dizzy spells? Those memory lapses? I told you that your nervous system is completely shot from the stress of your old corporate life. It's a good thing you have us to take care of you, manage the household accounts, and handle all the complicated legal paperwork for your own protection. You'd be completely lost without us, wouldn't you?" "Yes, Sarah," I whispered, playing the part of the compliant, gaslighted victim down to the last syllable. "I don't know what I would do without you." "Good," she said, her tone hardening just a fraction as she tossed a thick manila folder across the marble island, letting it slide right to the edge where my hand rested. "Because today is the day we finally clean up all the loose ends. That folder contains the final asset restructuring and property transfer agreements we talked about. Review them, make sure your signature is clear, and have them ready by the time Richard and the others arrive this afternoon. No delays, Thomas. I'm tired of your endless incompetence." I looked down at the manila folder. Inside were the final legal nooses designed to transfer the last remnants of my independent wealth, my credit standing, and my legal innocence directly into their grasping hands, leaving me completely naked before the federal investigative hammer that was already poised to strike outside. I'll look it over," I murmured, clutching the folder against my chest with a trembling hand, intentionally projecting the image of a cornered animal waiting for the final blow. David let out a sharp, barking laugh, tossing a crumpled napkin directly onto the floor right next to my boots. "Pick that up on your way to the pantry, old man. We're having guests tonight, and this kitchen needs to look spotless. Mom doesn't want her friends smelling your pathetic aura of failure the moment they walk through the door." I looked down at the napkin on the floor, then up at David's sneering face, and for a split second, the raw, primal urge to crush his jaw beneath my fist surged through my veins. But I swallowed the impulse down, locking it away behind an impenetrable wall of iron discipline. Let them gloat. Let them humiliate me. Every single arrogant word, every single thuggish demand, every single cruel smirk was just another stone added to the mountain of psychological abuse that would completely destroy their credibility when the federal warrants were executed later tonight. "I'll clean it up," I said quietly, bending down to retrieve the napkin with exaggerated slowness, playing the cowering servant right to the edge of the knife. As I moved toward the pantry, My eyes swept across the crown molding above the kitchen cabinets, specifically at the tiny, almost invisible pinhole lens of the micro camera I had hidden behind the wooden trim 3 months ago. That camera had captured every single second of their psychological warfare. It had recorded David and Chloe practicing the forgery of my signature. It had captured Sarah coaching her children on how to gaslight me into believing I was losing my mind. It had recorded every single threat, every single insult, and every single plot point of their domestic tyranny, streaming the encrypted backups directly to a secure cloud server managed by my federal colleagues in Boston. The psychological game they were playing wasn't breaking me. It was building the airtight case that would ensure none of them ever saw the light of day again. Later that morning, while Sarah was upstairs coordinating her wardrobe and reviewing her international banking logs in the primary suite, and the 2 teenagers were holed up in the media room playing video games at top volume, I slipped quietly down the back hallway toward the basement utility room. The basement was cold, smelling faintly of damp pine and old concrete, lit only by a single dim overhead bulb that cast long, distorted shadows across the storage shelves. I walked past the spare lumber, the winter gear, and the rows of canned goods until I reached the small, locked storage closet tucked away beneath the main staircase, a room Sarah thought I didn't know how to access. Using a simple tension pick from my old field kit, I popped the brass lock on the door in less than 3 seconds. The door swung open silently on well-oiled hinges. Inside, stacked neatly against the back wall, were boxes upon boxes of personal belongings, financial files, and old correspondence that Sarah had supposedly cleared out and destroyed during our move from Boston. I pulled open a heavy cardboard box labeled Tax Records, 2021, and flipped through the folders until my fingers brushed against a thick stack of heavy cardstock documents. I pulled them out into the dim light and felt the breath catch in my throat. They weren't tax records. They were personal journals, medical logs, and psychiatric evaluation reports bearing Sarah's handwriting, alongside confidential correspondence between her and a corporate psychiatrist in Boston. As I flipped through the pages, a cold, sickening reality washed over me. Sarah hadn't just started poisoning my tea with neurosedatives 8 months ago when we moved to Vermont. She had been administering chemical depressants and memory suppression agents to me before. We even got married, all the way back when we were living in our brownstone in Boston. She had deliberately manufactured the symptoms of cognitive decline, erratic behavior, and professional burnout to convince my former business associates, my doctors, and myself that I was suffering from early-onset neurological deterioration. Every single professional failure, every memory lapse, every moment of confusion that I had blamed on my own aging brain was a manufactured symptom, carefully brewed in a laboratory and fed to me daily by the woman who claimed to love me. And David and Chloe had been in on it from day one. A handwritten sticky note clipped to one of the medical logs, written in Chloe's precise, neat teenage handwriting when she was just 15, read, "Mom, the new dosage is working great. He forgot where he put his car keys 3 times today and apologized to me for yelling when I didn't even say anything. Keep pushing him. The corporate power of attorney forms are almost ready to sign." I stood in the freezing dark of the basement storage room, holding the paper that proved my entire life had been systematically dismantled by a family of cold-blooded sociopaths who viewed me not as a husband or a father, but as a human farm animal to be milked, slaughtered, and discarded. There was no room for mercy left in my heart. The last lingering embers of affection, hesitation, or doubt were completely extinguished, replaced by a cold, absolute, unyielding desire for justice. A sharp, heavy thud echoed from the floorboards directly above my head, followed by Sarah's sharp, commanding voice calling down the basement stairs. "Thomas, what are you doing hiding down in that damp hole? The holiday delivery from the local butcher just arrived at the front door, and the kitchen is a mess. Get up here right now and start prepping the roast, or so help me God, you won't see another peaceful hour in this house for the rest of your life." I carefully placed the psychiatric files back into the box, locked the storage closet door behind me with the precision of a ghost, and smoothed down the front of my shirt. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the mask of the broken, subservient husband slide smoothly back over my face like a well-oiled glove. "Coming, Sarah," I called back up the stairs, letting a tired, submissive quiver crack my voice just enough to sound entirely authentic. "I was just checking the furnace pressure like you asked. I'll be right there." I climbed the basement stairs back into the bright, warm, beautifully decorated kitchen where my wife and her two vicious accomplices were waiting, completely unaware that the countdown to their destruction had already reached its final, unstoppable minutes. Let them bark orders. Let them demand I clean the floors. Let them bask in the arrogant delusion that they had won the game. The Thanksgiving dinner table was fully set. The guests were scheduled to arrive in a few hours, and the feast I had prepared for them was going to be the most shocking, earth-shattering meal in the history of Vermont. The morning sun over the snow-laden peaks of Vermont offered no warmth, casting only a pale, watery glare across the frozen expanse of the backyard as the grandfather clock in the hallway struck 8:00 a.m. I stood by the kitchen window, holding a mug of black coffee that I had not brewed, staring out at the desolate white landscape when the sharp, authoritative rattle of the brass letterbox sliced through the quiet. A heavy, official-looking envelope had just been shoved through the front door slot, landing with a dull, sickening thud against the hardwood floor of the entryway. In normal suburban households, morning mail brought bills, catalogs, or cheerful holiday greetings from distant relatives. But in this house, this magnificent timber-framed prison that I had poured every drop of my life savings into acquiring, the mail brought something far more final. Chapter 5 of their grand, calculated destruction didn't arrive as a whisper. It dropped like an acoustic bomb, shattering the last lingering illusions I held about the safety of my physical world. I didn't rush to pick it up. I watched from the shadows of the kitchen archway as Chloe, who was strolling down the stairs in an oversized cashmere sweater while lazily scrolling through her phone, kicked the cream-colored envelope aside with the casual indifference of someone stepping over a piece of trash. She didn't look down. She didn't need to. She already knew what it was. When she disappeared into the kitchen to pour her artisanal matcha latte, I walked slowly out to the entryway, picked up the envelope, and felt the heavy, textured paper stock beneath my fingertips. The return address printed across the upper left corner was not a utility company or a local merchant. It was embossed with the formal, austere crest of the Green Mountain Regional Trust and Commercial Lending Corporation, the very financial institution Sarah had claimed was handling our estate tax restructuring and mortgage optimization portfolio 6 months ago. I didn't open it in the hallway. I slipped it quietly into the inner pocket of my fleece vest, keeping my face completely blank as I walked back toward the kitchen, where Sarah and David had just joined Chloe around the marble island. "Did something come in the mail, Thomas? Or are you just standing out there admiring your own shadow?" Sarah asked, her voice dripping with that familiar saccharine condescension that she reserved exclusively for me when no outsiders were around. She was dressed impeccably in a tailored winter white blazer, her blonde hair styled to absolute perfection, radiating the effortless aura of a successful corporate executive preparing to host a flawless holiday gathering. "Just junk mail, Sarah," I replied, keeping my voice low, submissive, and trembling just enough to satisfy her craving for psychological dominance. "Advertisements for local firewood delivery." David let out a sharp, mocking snort, leaning against the counter with a half-eaten pastry in his hand. "Figures. The only thing he's actually qualified to manage is a stack of circulars. Make sure you clear out the recycling bin before noon, Thomas. We can't have the mudroom looking like a garbage dump when Richard and the others arrive tonight for dinner." "Of course, David," I murmured, keeping my eyes fixed respectfully on the floor, playing the dutiful, broken-down servant to absolute perfection. A few minutes later, under the pretext of checking the basement wood pellet supply, I slipped down the back stairs into the cold, concrete-floored utility room, locked the heavy timber door behind me, and pulled the cream-colored envelope from my pocket. My hands were entirely steady. The initial shock had long since burned away, replaced by the ice-cold focus of a man examining the final measurements of a trap he had already dismantled from the inside out. I slid open the top edge of the envelope with a small utility knife and unfolded the thick sheaf of formal legal notices inside. The words hit my eyes with the brutal, blinding clarity of a sledgehammer striking plate glass. It wasn't a routine statement. It was a formal notice of default and immediate foreclosure acceleration issued by the Green Mountain Regional Trust. According to the legal filings, The Timber Lodge in Vermont. The sanctuary I had purchased 18 months ago by liquidating every single penny of my retirement fund, my corporate stock options, and the inheritance left by my parents, had been placed under a secondary commercial mortgage and 100% equity cross-collateralization lien just 4 days after we closed on the property. Worse still, the primary borrower listed on the loan documents wasn't the Verde Pines Family LLC. It was a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands under a fictitious entity named Vanguard Holdings Limited, bearing a single, authorizing signature at the bottom of the liability rider, Thomas Vance. Except, as I inspected the signature block under the harsh glare of the basement utility bulb, the lines didn't match my natural handwriting. It was a flawless, hyper-accurate digital tracing, the exact same forgery style that Chloe practiced on her art tablet downstairs, executed with a precision that only someone with deep access to my personal banking keys and notarized identity profiles could manage. The entire property, every square foot of timber, every handcrafted stone fireplace, every acre of snow-covered pine forest surrounding us, did not belong to me, nor did it belong to our family trust. It belonged to a predatory lending syndicate managed by Sarah and her corporate co-conspirators. They had used my clean credit profile, my liquid capital, and my signature to purchase the property, immediately leveraged it to the absolute maximum limit of its commercial valuation, siphoned millions of dollars in cash out through offshore conduits, and set me up to absorb the entire legal and financial fallout when the foreclosure hammer finally dropped. Legal liability for $2.8 million in fraudulent commercial debt rested squarely on my shoulders. If the federal banking regulators or the state foreclosure courts moved in, Sarah and her children would walk away clean as victims of an unstable, financially reckless husband, while I would be hauled away in federal chains to spend the rest of my natural life behind bars for grand larceny, mortgage fraud, and systemic credit manipulation. A sudden heavy thud echoed from the floorboards directly above my head, followed by the muffled sound of footsteps pacing across the kitchen ceiling. I didn't panic. I folded the foreclosure notice with meticulous care, slid it back into its envelope, and tucked it securely inside my inner pocket, alongside the digital drive containing all the encrypted evidence of their multi-year conspiracy. They thought they had checkmated me. They believed that by dropping this notice into my hands on the morning of Thanksgiving, they would crush my remaining spirit, force me into a state of total psychological collapse, and make me sign over the final residual property waivers without a word of protest later that evening. They had no idea that the arrival of this foreclosure notice wasn't a disaster for me. It was the final missing piece of evidence required by the federal task force waiting quietly 2 miles down the snow-choked Ridge Road. I climbed the basement stairs back up to the main floor, my movements measured and calm. As I stepped into the hallway, Sarah was standing by the coat rack, adjusting her scarf and speaking in low, urgent tones into her smartphone, her voice dropping the sweet suburban cadence she used for the public and adopting the sharp, cold, commanding register of a criminal syndicate boss. "Yes, the final notice was delivered this morning just like we planned," Sarah murmured into the phone, turning her back to the hallway, completely unaware of my silent presence just 10 feet away. "The old man looks entirely broken. He hasn't said a single word of protest all morning. By tonight, once we get him to sign the final property release papers during dinner, we'll lock down the title transfer, file the bankruptcy protection waiver under his name, and the entire Vermont asset will be legally cleared for liquidation before the federal auditors in Boston even realize the accounts have been drained. Make sure Richard has the secondary wire transfers ready to route to the offshore accounts by midnight." She hung up the phone, turned around abruptly, and nearly dropped her device when she saw me standing quietly in the dim hallway just behind her. For a fraction of a second, a flash of pure primal panic crossed her polished, beautiful face. Her hazel eyes widened, and her breath hitched in her throat as she looked at me, standing there in the shadows with my hands tucked quietly into my pockets. But just as quickly as the mask slipped, her professional survival instinct kicked back in, smoothing her features into that cold, impenetrable wall of corporate composure. "How long have you been standing there, Thomas?" she asked, her voice sharp, defensive, and laced with a thin veneer of forced authority. "Long enough, Sarah," I replied, my tone entirely level, completely devoid of the trembling fear, stuttering confusion, or pathetic pleading that she had grown accustomed to over the past year. Sarah froze. She stared at me, her eyes narrowing as she searched my face for the familiar signs of chemical brain fog, emotional exhaustion, or panic. But she found none. What she saw in my eyes wasn't the broken, submissive house pet she had tortured for months. She saw a cold, absolute, unyielding stillness that mirrored the frozen wilderness outside. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, stepping forward with an instinctive defensive posture, though a faint tremor of unease flickered at the edge of her voice. "Did you check the mail? Did you look at the documents on the kitchen island? Your financial negligence has brought us to the brink of ruin, Thomas. If you don't sign those papers today, we are going to lose everything. The house, the savings, the kids' future. Do you understand me? You did this. Your incompetence destroyed us." The theatricality of her performance was staggering. The righteous anger, the betrayed wife routine, the desperate mother protecting her children. It was a masterpiece of narcissistic manipulation. I didn't yell. I didn't slam doors. I didn't raise my voice by a single decibel. I simply took a slow, deliberate step closer to her, letting the heavy silence of the hallway stretch out between us like a physical weight. "You're right, Sarah," I said softly, a dark, humorless smile touching the corners of my mouth. "I did bring us to the brink of ruin, but don't worry about the paperwork. I've reviewed every single document, every single hidden loan, and every single forged signature in detail." I reached slowly into my inner pocket, pulled out the cream-colored foreclosure notice, and held it out toward her, letting it dangle loosely between my fingers. "In fact," I continued, my voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper that made her step back involuntarily against the wall, "I've already made sure that the appropriate authorities have received a complete, unabridged copy of every single transaction associated with this property. Every shell corporation, every offshore wire, every toxic tea prescription, and every fraudulent signature. The accounts are frozen, Sarah. The trap is shut." Sarah's face drained of every drop of color, turning as white and lifeless as the snowdrifts plastered against the windows outside. The polished corporate executive, the mastermind embezzler, the cold-blooded predator, all of it instantly evaporated, leaving behind a terrified woman staring into the absolute abyss of her own exposure. You knew," she whispered, her voice cracking into a dry, breathless gasp as her hands flew up to cover her mouth. You weren't—" "No, Sarah," I whispered, stepping past her toward the front door as the grandfather clock chimed the arrival of 9:00 a.m., signaling that the final day of our domestic nightmare had officially begun. I wasn't losing my mind at all. I was just waiting for the right moment to serve dinner. Without waiting for her to recover, I turned on my heel, leaving her standing alone in the freezing hallway, trembling from head to toe as the reality of her impending destruction finally crashed down upon her like an avalanche. The house was quiet. The snow continued to fall outside, burying the tracks and sealing off the world. But inside, the countdown had reached its final seconds, and the feast of a lifetime was ready to be served. The grandfather clock in the entryway chimed noon, its heavy, resonant strokes echoing through the silent, timber-framed corridors of the Vermont cabin like the tolling of a cathedral bell. Outside, the blizzard had temporarily subsided into a heavy, blinding white blanket that swallowed the surrounding pine forest in an eerie, suffocating stillness. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the silent, vibrating tension of a coiled spring about to snap. Sarah had locked herself inside the primary suite upstairs ever since our chilling exchange in the hallway, while David and Chloe remained holed up in the media room, their low, conspiratorial murmurs occasionally leaking out beneath the heavy wooden door. I stood in the center of the kitchen, calmly wiping down the marble island with a clean linen cloth, my mind entirely clear, sharp, and focused on the penultimate layer of the grand deception. Chapter 6 of their multi-year masterpiece didn't just reveal the financial embezzlement or the psychological gaslighting. It exposed the most intimate, devastating betrayal of all, the shadow that had walked beside me through the darkest years of my life, smiling in my face while sliding a dagger between my shoulder blades. For the past 3 years, ever since the grueling corporate collapse in Boston that had stripped away my initial standing, My primary emotional anchor hadn't been my wife. It had been Richard Vance, my college roommate, my former business partner, my best man at my wedding to Sarah, and the man I still called every single Tuesday night to pour out my soul, confess my marital inadequacies, and seek advice on how to save a failing marriage. Whenever Sarah's coldness grew too suffocating, whenever the self-doubt induced by her chemical neurosedatives threatened to tear my cognitive grip apart, Richard had been there on the other end of the encrypted messaging line. "Hang in there, old friend," he would say with that warm, reassuring baritone that had guided me through half a lifetime of crises. Marriage is hard, especially with teenagers and the pressure of a new life in Vermont. Sarah loves you, she's just high-strung. Keep working on it. I've got your back, Thomas. I always have. I had trusted Richard with my deepest insecurities, my professional fears, and my blind, unwavering loyalty when he announced 2 years ago that a corporate buyout had forced him to relocate permanently to Chicago. I had mourned his absence like the loss of a brother, regularly sending him updates on our cabin renovations and asking his professional opinion on our estate planning documents. I pulled my encrypted satellite laptop from beneath the cushion of the wooden armchair by the hearth, popped open the secure data partition, and navigated to a hidden folder labeled Project Janus, Intercept Logs. What I found inside wasn't just a record of friendly phone calls. It was a comprehensive, highly classified surveillance dossier compiled by the Federal Intelligence Assets who had been quietly tracking Richard's corporate shell network across the Northeast Corridor for the past 18 months. Richard Vance had never moved to Chicago. That entire narrative had been a fabricated staging maneuver designed to create physical distance while maintaining absolute operational control over my life from the shadows. Richard wasn't just Sarah's business associate or a sympathetic confidant. He was the primary financial architect of the phantom offshore syndicates that had siphoned $4.2 million from the Boston Credit Union. More than that, he was Sarah's long-term lover, her co-conspirator, and the shadow mastermind who had orchestrated our entire relocation to this isolated Vermont cabin to isolate me from my former network, strip me of my assets, and set me up to take the absolute fall for their grand white-collar crimes. Every single late-night conversation we had shared over the past 3 years, every vulnerable confession I made about my failing marriage, every doubt I expressed regarding my mental stability, every piece of personal data I shared in confidence had been immediately recorded, transcribed, and weaponized against me by the two people I trusted most in this world. They hadn't just used my insecurities to manipulate me, they had laughed at them. They had shared voice notes mocking my pathetic loyalty, trading inside jokes about how easily a broken man could be led to his own slaughter like a lamb walking into an abattoir. A sharp, vibrating chime from my secure laptop interrupted my inspection. It was an encrypted text packet coming through the Federal Relay Node stationed 2 miles down the Ridge Road. Target vehicle inbound. The short encrypted text read, "A black luxury SUV just passed the Lower Ranger Station checkpoint, heading up the private access road toward the cabin. Estimated arrival time, 12 minutes. Occupant matches biometric profile of Richard Vance. Shall we intercept at the gate?" I stared at the screen, a cold, humorless smile touching the corners of my mouth. Intercept him at the gate? Absolutely not. Letting Richard slip away or getting arrested at the perimeter fence was far too kind an ending for a traitor of his magnitude. The trap was set, the evidence was logged, and the federal task force was already locked in position just beyond the tree line. Negative. I typed back swiftly with a steady hand. Let him through the front gate. Let him walk right into the dining room. We're serving the full course tonight, and I want all the guests seated at the table together when the lights go out. Copy that. Standing by for final signal. The response flashed back instantly. I closed the laptop lid, slid the device back into its protective case, and stood up from the armchair just as heavy, hurried footsteps echoed down the staircase. Sarah appeared in the hallway, having rapidly changed out of her casual wear into an expensive, shimmering emerald green evening dress that contrasted sharply with the pale, terrified panic still lingering in her eyes. The encounter in the hallway earlier that morning had thoroughly shattered her invincible corporate armor, but the arrival of their primary co-conspirator had clearly reignited a desperate, clawing survival instinct within her. "Richard is on his way up the mountain," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a harsh, breathless whisper as she grabbed my forearm with cold, trembling fingers. Her nails dug sharply into my skin, but I didn't flinch. He caught wind of the federal inquiry flags hitting the Boston clearinghouse this morning. He's coming to finalize the asset transfer papers and shut down the holding LLC before the holiday weekend ends. Listen to me, Thomas. If you sign those final papers right now, before he walks through that front door, we can still fix this. We can split the remaining liquidity, you can walk away clean with enough cash to start over in Florida, and the kids and I will handle the corporate restructuring. But if you try to pull any of your federal intelligence bluffs when Richard gets here, he and his legal team will bury you so deep under federal perjury charges that you will never see the sun again. Do you understand me? We hold all the cards. I looked down at her hand gripping my arm, the hand that had brewed my toxic teas for a year, the hand that had forged my signatures on stolen loan documents, the hand that had caressed me while whispering sweet lies of eternal devotion. Slowly, deliberately, I reached up, peeled her fingers away from my sleeve one by one, and stepped back with a calm, measured detachment that terrified her far more than any outburst of anger could have. "You're right, Sarah," I replied, my voice chillingly smooth and level. "We shouldn't rush things. Let's wait until Richard gets here. After all, what's a family Thanksgiving dinner without the guest of honor? It wouldn't be proper to celebrate without my oldest, most trusted friend sitting right across the table from me." Before Sarah could formulate a response, the low, throaty rumble of a heavy-duty engine grumbling through the thick snow outside cut through the heavy silence of the cabin. A pair of blinding amber headlights swept across the triple-paned living room windows, painting long, distorted shadows across the vaulted cedar beams as a black luxury SUV crunched its tires over the frozen driveway and ground to a halt right outside the front porch. The front door latch clicked, and heavy, confident footsteps echoed across the wooden porch boards. The footsteps of a man who believed he was walking into a conquered territory to claim the final spoils of war. The heavy oak front door swung open, and Richard Vance stepped into the warm entryway, shaking the wet Vermont snow off his expensive cashmere overcoat, flashing that familiar, charismatic $1,000,000 smile that had once convinced me he was the finest friend a man could ever ask for. "Well, well, well," Richard boomed, his rich baritone voice filling the rustic hallway with an artificial warmth that smelled faintly of high-end cologne and old money. "Look at this winter wonderland. I told you traffic over the mountain pass wouldn't be an issue if you took the upper ridge route, Sarah. And look at our host, our favorite corporate consultant looking healthier than ever." I walked right up to me, extending a warm, open hand for a traditional masculine grip, his eyes sparkling with the smug, condescending triumph of a predator who had successfully fleeced a blind, trusting fool. I looked down at his outstretched hand, then slowly raised my gaze to meet his eyes, letting a faint, knowing smile touch my lips. "It's good to see you too, Richard," I said softly, making no move to take his hand. "I've been waiting for this dinner for a very, very long time." The grandfather clock in the main hallway struck 4:00 p.m., its heavy bronze chimes vibrating through the timber-framed walls of the Vermont cabin with an ominous rhythmic resonance that felt less like a marker of time and more like a countdown to an execution. Outside, the blizzard had temporarily dissolved into a thick, low-hanging mist of pale blue twilight, wrapping the isolated mountain ridge in a shroud of absolute, suffocating silence. But inside, the air was saturated with the rich, heavy aromas of roasted turkey, melted butter, caramelized brown sugar, and imported herbs, a traditional American holiday feast meticulously staged to mask the rot and corruption festering beneath the floorboards. Chapter 7 of their grand design wasn't just a holiday gathering. It was the final dress rehearsal for a murder of character, a masterclass in psychological warfare, where the executioners and the victim sat under the same roof, smiling across an abyss of mutual deception. I stood in the center of the sprawling open-plan kitchen, wearing a crisp, starched white button-down shirt beneath a dark charcoal wool vest, my sleeves rolled up to my forearms as I basted the massive 20-pound free-range turkey resting in the heavy copper roasting pan. Every movement I made was calm, calculated, and precise. To anyone watching, to Sarah, to her 2 teenage children, or to Richard, who was currently sitting in the adjacent living room pouring himself a generous glass of 20-year-old bourbon. I was the picture of the submissive, broken-down husband, desperately trying to earn his place back at the family table through culinary servitude. "Make sure you don't overcook the cranberry reduction this time, Thomas," Sarah called out from the dining room, her voice carrying that sharp, imperious edge she used whenever she wanted to remind me of my place in the household hierarchy. She was adjusting the heavy silver candlesticks on the long mahogany dining table, smoothing out the imported lace tablecloth with manicured fingers that trembled ever so slightly despite her best efforts to project icy composure. "Richard prefers his sauces tart, not sweet. And for God's sake, don't drop the serving platter like you did last Thanksgiving in Boston. I'm in no mood for your clumsy theatrics tonight." "I've got it under control, Sarah," I replied, my voice sounding flat, submissive, and hollow, the exact vocal register she had grown accustomed to manipulating over the past 8 months. From the living room couch came the low, relaxed rumble of Richard's laughter. He was lounging against the leather cushions with his legs crossed, looking every bit the successful, charismatic corporate executive, taking a well-deserved holiday break from the pressures of the Boston financial sector. The tailored Italian wool suit he wore contrasted sharply with the rustic log cabin aesthetic of the room, symbolizing the modern corporate greed that had invaded our sanctuary. "Relax, Sarah. Let the old boy breathe," Richard called out lazily, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass as he caught my eye across the open room. A smug, proprietary smirk played at the corners of his mouth. "Thomas has always been a bit heavy-handed in the kitchen, but he follows instructions eventually, don't you, buddy? Especially when he realizes it's in his own best interest to keep everyone happy." "Of course, Richard," I murmured, keeping my head bowed over the roasting pan so they couldn't see the cold, unyielding fire burning in my eyes. "Everything is going to be just the way you want it." David and Chloe sauntered into the kitchen a few moments later, dressed in expensive holiday designer wear that screamed upper-class entitlement. They didn't look at me. They walked right past my workspace as if I were a piece of furniture, grabbing handfuls of roasted pecans from the counter bowl before flopping down at the kitchen island. "Is the final paperwork ready for him to sign after dessert?" David whispered loudly to his mother, not even bothering to lower his voice or pretend I wasn't standing 3 feet away. "I'm sick of looking at his miserable face. As soon as he signs the transfer deeds and the liability waivers tonight, we can finally list this overpriced shack with the Miami broker and get back to civilization." "It's right here in my leather portfolio," Sarah replied softly, tapping a sleek black leather folder resting on the sideboard next to the china cabinet. Her voice was laced with a venomous satisfaction. "Everything is covered. The property transfer, the debt assumption rider, the voluntary bankruptcy declaration, and the medical waiver acknowledging his voluntary withdrawal from financial management due to cognitive fatigue. Once he puts his signature on those dotted lines tonight, he won't just be legally broke. He'll be stepping directly into a federal prison cell for grand larceny, and there won't be a damn thing he can do about it." "Brilliant execution, as always, my dear," Richard murmured, walking over to join Sarah by the sideboard, wrapping a familiar, possessive arm around her waist and pressing a light, intimate kiss to her cheek, right out in the open, completely unbothered by the fact that I was standing right across the room. It was a calculated display of psychological dominance, a final humiliation designed to break my spirit completely before the ink touched the paper. I turned away from the oven, picked up a heavy silver carving knife, and began sharpening it against a steel rod with slow, rhythmic, metallic strokes. Shing, shing, shing. The harsh, grating sound cut sharply through the holiday chatter, causing Richard to momentarily drop his arm from Sarah's waist and look over his shoulder with a faint flicker of unease in his eyes. "Easy with the cutlery there, Thomas," Richard forced a laugh, though his voice lacked its previous confident warmth. "You look like you're preparing for a medieval execution rather than a Thanksgiving dinner." "Just making sure the blade is sharp enough for the turkey, Richard," I replied, keeping my eyes locked on the gleaming steel edge, my voice devoid of any emotion. "You never know when you have to cut through something tough." Sarah shot me a sharp, warning glare, her hazel eyes narrowing into suspicious slits. For a split second, the polished corporate mask slipped, revealing the raw, primal terror of a predator, sensing a trap long after it had walked inside. But she quickly recovered, smoothing her emerald green dress and forcing a brittle, icy smile onto her face. "Finish the gravy, Thomas," she commanded coldly. "And make sure you wear your good suit for dinner tonight. We have important business to discuss as soon as the last bite is swallowed, and I expect you to look presentable when the final chapter of your life in this family is officially written." "I wouldn't miss it for the world, Sarah," I whispered, sliding the sharp carving knife back into its wooden block with a clean, definitive snap. I walked past them without another word, heading up the back staircase toward the austere quiet of my guest bedroom on the second floor. As I closed the door behind me and threw the heavy brass latch, the ambient noise of the holiday preparations faded into a low, muffled hum. I walked over to the closet, pulled out a custom-tailored dark navy Armani suit, the very same suit I had worn 6 years ago on the day I married Sarah in Newport, and slipped it on with meticulous care. Every button fastened, every cuff aligned, every crease smoothed out. I didn't look like a broken, defeated house pet anymore. I looked like a federal investigator preparing to close the final file on an international criminal syndicate. I pulled my encrypted satellite laptop from beneath the mattress, opened the secure comms channel, and executed a single final command sequence. On the screen, a small green status indicator flashed twice, confirming that the federal interdiction team stationed 2 miles down the ridge road had received the activation code. "Feast is prepared. All guests are seated. Execute breach protocol precisely at 8:00 p.m. I closed the laptop, slipped my encrypted drive into my inner breast pocket, and checked my watch. It was 5:45 p.m. 2 hours until the final curtain rose. 2 hours until the table they had set to destroy me became the very courtroom that condemned them to eternity. I took one final look at my reflection in the frosted glass of the bedroom window, straightened my silk tie, and turned around to walk back down the stairs. The Thanksgiving dinner table was fully set. The candles were burning bright, and the wolves were waiting downstairs for their prey. They had no idea that the lamb they invited to slaughter was actually the butcher holding the key to the abattoir. The grandfather clock in the main hallway struck 7:55 p.m., its heavy, bronze chimes vibrating through the timber-framed walls of the Vermont cabin with an ominous, suffocating resonance that felt less like a marker of time and more like a death knell. Outside, the blizzard had locked the mountain ridge in a frozen, impenetrable white prison, burying the access roads and sealing the property off from the rest of the civilization. Inside, the dining room was illuminated by the soft, warm glow of imported silver candelabras, casting long, dancing shadows across the mahogany table laden with a magnificent golden-brown roasted turkey, silver chafing dishes, and crystal goblets filled with vintage Napa Valley Cabernet. Chapter 8 of their grand, calculated design wasn't just a holiday meal. It was the climax of a psychological war, the moment where the stage was fully set for an execution that would turn into an absolute blood-chilling reversal of fortune. I stood at the head of the long mahogany table, impeccably dressed in my dark navy Armani suit, my posture straight, my expression completely unreadable. To my left sat Sarah, radiating an aura of polished, triumphant elegance in her emerald green dress, her hazel eyes glittering with the predatory satisfaction of a victor about to claim her final prize. To my right sat Richard, swirling his red wine with a relaxed, arrogant smirk, looking every bit the conquering hero who had successfully dismantled a man's life without ever dirtying his own hands. Down the sides of the table sat David and Chloe, their faces flushed with holiday excitement and the intoxicating promise of the millions they were about to inherit once the final paperwork was signed. "Well," Richard announced, raising his crystal goblet high into the air, breaking the heavy, vibrating silence that had settled over the room as we took our seats. His rich baritone voice echoed off the vaulted cedar beams with theatrical warmth. "To family, to new beginnings, and to putting the difficult chapters of the past firmly behind us. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone." "Happy Thanksgiving," Sarah echoed softly, her voice smooth and sweet like poisoned honey as she lifted her glass, her eyes locking onto mine with a sharp, challenging glint. David and Chloe raised their glasses in unison, exchanging knowing, cruel smirks across the table. No one invited me to toast. No one looked at me with anything other than absolute open contempt, treating me like an invisible fixture, a piece of furniture that was about to be discarded into the trash bin of history. I didn't raise my glass. I sat motionless, my hands resting calmly on the edge of the polished mahogany surface, my gaze fixed steadily on Sarah's face. "Aren't you going to drink with us, Thomas?" Richard asked, his smile faltering just a fraction as he noticed my total lack of participation. A faint, nervous edge crept into his voice. "After all, it's a celebration. By the end of this evening, all your financial burdens will be lifted, and you can finally start fresh. Isn't that what you've wanted?" "Yes, Richard," I replied, my voice cutting through the ambient holiday sounds with a chilling, razor-sharp calm that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "My burdens are about to be lifted permanently. But before we touch our wine, I think it's customary to share a few memories. After all, a family dinner shouldn't just focus on the future. It should honor the hard work everyone put into getting us here." Sarah's face stiffened instantly. The triumphant smile vanished from her lips, replaced by a sudden sharp flicker of primitive panic. "Don't start with your dramatic nonsense tonight, Thomas," she snapped, her voice dropping its sweet cadence and hardening into a dangerous command. "We have business to attend to after the meal. Pick up your fork, eat your dinner, and let's not ruin the holiday with your pathetic whining." "Oh, I'm not whining, Sarah," I whispered, a dark, humorless smile touching the corners of my mouth as I slowly slid my right hand off the table and reached down into the leather briefcase resting quietly against my chair legs. "In fact, I've prepared a very special presentation for our guests. I think Richard in particular will find the exhibits fascinating." Before Sarah could lunge across the table to stop me, I popped the brass latches of the leather briefcase, pulled out a thick, heavy stack of certified digital transcripts, forensic bank routing logs, and high-definition printed exhibits, and slammed them down right in the center of the mahogany table, scattering the silverware and knocking over a crystal wine glass in a brilliant splash of crimson red. What is the meaning of this?" Richard stammered, shoving his chair back slightly as his eyes dropped to the top document exposed on the pile. The color drained entirely from Richard's face, turning him as pale and lifeless as a sheet of bond paper. The top document wasn't a standard financial statement. It was the master corporate registry log of the Cayman Islands shell company, Vanguard Holdings Limited. Bearing his personal digital signature, his corporate tax ID, and a complete itemized ledger of the $4.2 million siphoned directly from the Boston Credit Union, where Sarah served as senior risk director. "Read it carefully, Richard," I said, my voice dropping to an icy, commanding register that completely paralyzed everyone at the table. "That's the ledger tracking every single dollar you and my loving wife stole from the regional lending reserves over the past 4 years, using my personal credit profile as the legal firewall. A very impressive operation. Too bad the federal banking investigators in Boston have already mirrored every single byte of that database onto their primary secure servers." Sarah stood up so violently, her chair crashed backward onto the hardwood floor with a deafening clatter. Her eyes were wide with blind, absolute terror, her chest heaving as she stared at me as if I were a ghost risen from the grave. "You're lying!" she screamed, her voice cracking into a hysterical, breathless shriek that shattered the pristine suburban facade once and for all. "It's all lies. He's insane. He's been suffering from severe neurological degeneration for years. He fabricated those documents in his paranoid delusions. David, Chloe, call the local clinic right now. Tell them your father has completely lost his mind." Neither David nor Chloe moved an inch. The two teenagers sat frozen in their seats, staring blankly at the documents scattered across the table, their arrogant teenage snarls completely replaced by slack-jawed horror as the terrifying reality of their mother's criminal enterprise crashed down upon them. They weren't just participating in a family squabble anymore. They were staring down the barrel of active federal felony indictments for aiding and abetting grand white-collar larceny. "Don't bother calling the clinic, Sarah," I said smoothly, reaching back into the briefcase and pulling out a second, thicker file folder, tossing it directly across the table toward David and Chloe. The folder slid across the mahogany wood and came to rest right in front of David's plate. He hesitantly opened the cover, his trembling hands flipping through the pages. Inside were high-resolution forensic printouts of the surveillance video logs captured by the micro cameras hidden in the living room molding. Footage explicitly recording David and Chloe practicing the forgery of my signature on commercial debt waivers, laughing hysterically while plotting my destruction, and openly celebrating the impending foreclosure of the home they claimed to hate. You recorded us?" Chloe whispered, her voice trembling violently as tears of sheer panic welled up in her eyes, her mascara running down her cheeks. "You put cameras in the house? You watched us?" "I watched every single second of your little theatrical performances, Chloe," I replied, my gaze hardening into unyielding steel as I looked at the two teenagers who had spent a year treating me like a house pet to be tortured. "You didn't just play along with your mother's game. You actively manufactured the fraudulent legal instruments designed to throw me into a federal prison. That makes you co-conspirators in a major international financial fraud syndicate. The federal sentencing guidelines for your age bracket carry a mandatory minimum of 10 years behind bars without parole." No, please," David choked out, the tough guy exterior completely shattering as he broke down into desperate, ugly sobs, burying his face in his hands. "Mom told us you were just signing papers. She said you were already ruined and we were just protecting ourselves. We didn't know it was federal. We didn't know." "You knew exactly what you were doing," I whispered coldly, turning my absolute focus back to Richard and Sarah, who stood frozen on opposite sides of the table like two trapped animals cornered in a burning forest. Richard's charismatic, million-dollar corporate facade was entirely gone. His expensive Italian suit looked wrinkled and pathetic, sweat pouring down his forehead as he stared at me with eyes full of venomous hatred and unadulterated fear. "You son of a bitch," Richard hissed, his voice dropping into a low, vicious snarl as his hand twitched instinctively toward a heavy silver steak knife resting beside his plate. "You set us up. All this time you weren't broken at all. You were playing us like fools." "Not fools, Richard," I replied, standing up slowly from my chair, my tall frame casting a long, commanding shadow across the candlelit room. "Just targets who forgot that a wolf doesn't stop being a predator just because he decides to lie down in the snow for a while." Richard's hand flashed out, snatching the heavy silver steak knife off the table with lightning speed, his face contorting into a mask of feral rage as he leaped around the mahogany divider, lunging straight across the room toward my throat with murderous intent. "I'll kill you, you old bastard!" Richard screamed, the blade flashing in the candlelight as he drove it forward. I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. With the effortless, lightning-fast muscle memory of my past life in deep-field federal intelligence operations, I sidestepped his clumsy lunge, caught his knife-wielding wrist in a vice-like grip, twisted his arm back with a sharp hydraulic snap that sent the blade clattering harmlessly across the hardwood floor, and swept his legs out from under him, slamming him face first onto the dining room carpet with enough force to knock every ounce of breath out of his lungs. I pressed my knee firmly into the center of his back, pinning him to the floor while he thrashed and cursed beneath my weight, completely helpless. Sarah let out a blood-curdling scream, grabbing a heavy crystal decanter from the sideboard and swinging it wildly toward my head, her eyes wild with murderous desperation. Before she could bring the glass crashing down upon me, a series of deafening concussive sounds exploded from the front entryway. Crash! The heavy oak front door of the cabin was blown completely off its reinforced steel hinges, splintering into 1,000 flying shards of timber as a blinding wall of white floodlights flooded the rustic interior, accompanied by the thunderous roar of heavy tactical boots stomping across the foyer. "FBI, federal warrants, nobody move!" A dozen heavily armored federal tactical agents, clad in black ballistic gear and bearing assault rifles with laser sights, poured into the dining room like an unstoppable avalanche, instantly securing every corner of the room, pinning Sarah against the sideboard, and throwing Richard face down into handcuffs with ruthless mechanical precision. The dining room of the Vermont cabin, the room built on lies, money laundering, psychological torture, and betrayal, was suddenly transformed into a federal interdiction zone, glowing with the flashing red and blue strobe lights of a dozen parked tactical vehicles stationed outside in the blinding snow. I stood up slowly from the floor, brushed a stray speck of dust off the sleeve of my Armani suit, and adjusted my silk tie. Sarah was wrenched backward by two tactical agents, her expensive emerald green dress tearing slightly as the cold steel jaws of a pair of handcuffs snapped securely around her wrists. As they dragged her past me toward the shattered front door, she stopped for a fraction of a second, her face twisted in an ugly mask of tears, hatred, and absolute stunned disbelief. You bastard!" she spat, her voice trembling with venom as the freezing mountain air rushed into the ruined cabin. Who the hell are you really? I looked down at her, my expression completely devoid of pity, warmth, or anger. Just the cold, absolute stillness of justice finally delivered. Just a husband who prepared dinner, Sarah, I whispered softly, turning my back on her as the federal agents escorted the weeping family out into the snow. Enjoy your stay in federal custody. The heavy oak front door of the Vermont cabin lay splintered and smoking across the wide planked pine floorboards, blasted off its reinforced iron hinges by a deafening concussive breach that shook the very foundations of the timber-frame sanctuary. Outside, the blinding white fury of the mountain blizzard was momentarily cut through by a violent strobe-like barrage of crimson and royal blue emergency beacons flashing from half a dozen heavily armored federal tactical vehicles parked haphazardly across the snow-choked driveway. Within seconds, a dozen elite Federal Bureau of Investigation tactical operators, clad in matte black ballistic gear, helmets, night vision mounts, and bearing high-powered carbines with precise laser sights, poured through the shattered entryway like an unstoppable wave of mechanized justice. FBI, federal warrants, down on the ground, nobody move! The tactical commander's voice boomed through the vaulted cedar-beamed dining room with a terrifying mechanical authority that completely obliterated the holiday cheer, replacing the scent of roasted turkey and warm cinnamon with the sharp, acrid smell of high-explosive breach charges and frozen gunpowder. Chapter 9 of their meticulously engineered nightmare wasn't just a dramatic police intervention. It was the ultimate earth-shattering reality check where every single layer of deception, betrayal, and criminal arrogance crashed down into a heap of total unmitigated destruction. Sarah let out a piercing, blood-curdling shriek of absolute terror as two massive tactical agents converged on her position by the sideboard, their combat boots crunching over the spilled red wine and shattered crystal scattered across the floor. She thrashed and fought against them like a trapped wild animal, her expensive emerald green dress tearing at the seams as cold, heavy steel jaws snapped securely around her slender wrists, binding her hands behind her back with merciless finality. Across the room, Richard, who had just seconds ago lunged at me with a heavy silver steak knife, was pinned face first into the plush dining room carpet by a tactical operator whose knee dug firmly into the center of his back. The high-powered corporate executive, the brilliant financial mastermind of the offshore embezzlement ring, groaned and wheezed as his tailored Italian wool suit was stained with melted butter and dirt, his cheek pressed flat against the floorboards as a pair of handcuffs locked onto his wrists with a sharp metallic click. Down the sides of the mahogany table, David and Chloe were huddled together in a state of catatonic shock. The two arrogant teenagers who had spent the last year mocking my existence, forging my signature, and celebrating my impending destruction, clutched each other and wept uncontrollably as federal agents gently but firmly guided them out of their chairs, securing their wrists with heavy plastic zip ties designed for juvenile detainees. I stood motionless at the head of the long mahogany table, impeccably dressed in my dark navy Armani suit, my posture straight, my expression completely unchanged. I didn't shout, I didn't celebrate, and I didn't gloat. I simply watched as the empire of lies they had spent years constructing around me was dismantled piece by piece in less than 60 seconds. The tactical commander stepped forward, his assault rifle lowered to a low-ready position as he surveyed the chaotic scene, his eyes locking onto mine with an expression of profound professional respect. He reached up, tapped the integrated communications headset strapped to his helmet, and spoke in a crisp, controlled register. Target area secured. All primary suspects neutralized and detained. Awaiting further instruction, Director Vance. Director Vance. The title hung heavily in the cold winter air of the dining room, cutting through the weeping and the frantic shouting like a razor blade. Sarah, who was being dragged backward past the head of the table toward the shattered front exit, froze instantly at the sound of that designation. Her eyes widened to an unnatural degree, her face completely drained of color as she stared at me with a mix of blind horror and incomprehension. She wrenched her head toward the tactical commander, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, breathless shriek of sheer denial. Director? What did you just call him? He's not a director. He's Thomas. He's just a broken, pathetic, retired financial consultant. He's an incompetent fool who can't even balance his own checkbook without my help." The tactical commander ignored her completely, stepping aside and standing at rigid attention as I walked slowly around the mahogany table, my leather-soled shoes clicking rhythmically against the floor. I stopped 2 feet away from where Sarah was being held by the 2 armored agents. The terrified, defeated woman standing before me bore no resemblance to the cold, untouchable corporate queen who had ruled this household with an iron fist of psychological cruelty. "You're wondering how a broken, chemically poisoned house pet managed to orchestrate an entire federal interdiction right under your nose, aren't you, Sarah?" I asked, my voice smooth, quiet, and chillingly devoid of emotion. Sarah stared up at me, her chest heaving violently, tears cutting clean tracks through her heavy makeup. Who are you?" she choked out, her voice trembling so hard the words barely formed. "What is this? What is all of this?" Slowly, deliberately, I reached into the inner breast pocket of my Armani jacket, pulled out a heavy, leather-bound federal credentials folio, and flipped it open under the warm glow of the silver chandelier. The gold-embossed seal of the United States Department of Justice gleamed brightly against the dark leather, positioned right beneath an active status executive badge bearing my full, unredacted credentials as a senior special agent and director of the Federal White-Collar Financial Intelligence Task Force. 6 years ago, before I ever met you at that charity gala in Boston, before I allowed myself to be lulled into the quiet illusion of a suburban family life, my primary responsibility wasn't corporate consulting, I said, my gaze locking onto her dilated, terrified pupils. My job was hunting down sophisticated international syndicates, corporate fraudsters, and executive-level white-collar grifters just like you and Richard. Sarah let out a ragged, breathless gasp, her knees suddenly buckling beneath her as the crushing weight of the revelation hit her with the force of a freight train. You knew," she whispered, her voice dropping to a hollow, broken rattle. "From the very beginning. You knew about the embezzlement?" "I knew about the shell corporations before we even bought this cabin, Sarah," I replied evenly. "When you suggested moving to an isolated timber lodge in the middle of Vermont to protect our family's future, you thought you were leading a blind, compliant Mark away from his support network and straight into an isolated slaughterhouse. In reality, you simply handed my tactical team the exact geographical coordinates and jurisdiction required to legally bundle your entire multi-state criminal enterprise under a single federal RICO indictment." The T? Sarah stammered, her mind racing backward through every single cruel detail of the past year. "The neurosedatives, the memory loss. You were taking them? Do you really think a senior federal investigator with 22 years of field experience wouldn't recognize a synthetic cholinesterase inhibitor mixed into his morning coffee and evening tea?" I offered a cold, humorless smile. "Every single batch of your custom herbal sedative was intercepted, chemically analyzed, and logged into federal evidence lockers the moment it arrived in the house. Your medical logs, your prescription receipts, and your toxicological reports form the foundation of an airtight attempted poisoning charge that will guarantee you spend the next several decades of your life behind federal concrete bars." Across the room, Richard thrashed violently against the floor as the tactical agent hauled him up to his feet, snapping a second pair of heavy steel cuffs over his wrists. The charismatic, untouchable corporate titan looked decades older, his face bruised from the impact, his eyes burning with a mixture of impotent rage and sheer paralyzing terror as he glared at me across the room. "You tricked us," Richard snarled, spitting a tiny fleck of blood onto the Persian rug as he was dragged toward the exit. "You played the victim for years just to build a federal case. That's entrapment. You're a corrupt bastard." "Not entrapment, Richard," I replied calmly, not even turning my head to look at him. "Just exceptional patience. When you deal with apex predators who think they are the smartest people in the room, you have to let them dig their own graves deep enough so they can never climb back out." The federal agents began moving the family out toward the armored transport vehicles waiting in the blinding snow outside. David and Chloe were escorted through the shattered front door first, sobbing hysterically into their expensive designer jackets as the freezing Vermont gale whipped their hair across their faces, their juvenile detention transport idling its engine with a deep rumbling roar. Next came Richard, shoved unceremoniously into the back of a black federal van, his Italian suit ruined, his reputation destroyed, and his freedom permanently revoked. Finally, Sarah was led toward the exit by the two tactical operators. Just before stepping out over the splintered threshold of the ruined doorway, she paused, turning her head back one last time to look at me standing alone in the center of the candlelit dining room. The anger, the arrogance, and the corporate superiority were entirely gone, replaced by a profound, hollow despair. "Was any of it real, Thomas?" she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the howling wind outside. "The marriage, the house. Did you ever feel anything for us at all?" I looked at her, at the woman who had traded my trust for a handful of stolen offshore currency, who had poisoned my mind and weaponized my love against me, who had turned my home into a prison and my children into my wardens. "I loved you enough to give you a home, Sarah," I replied quietly, my voice steady and unyielding. "And I loved justice enough to make sure you finally got what you earned." Without another word, the federal agents gently pushed her forward, guiding her out into the blinding snow and closing the heavy metal doors of the transport vehicle with a loud, definitive slam. The red and blue emergency beacons flashed across the vaulted cedar beams of the cabin, casting long, rhythmic shadows across the empty, ruined dining room. The silence rushed back in, heavy, cold, and absolute, filling the space where a family once pretended to live. I turned away from the shattered doorway, walked slowly over to the stone fireplace where a few dying embers still glowed beneath the ash, and reached into my breast pocket to pull out my encrypted satellite phone. The screen was dark, but as I pressed the power button, a single final notification flashed across the display from the Federal Interdiction Command Center down the Ridge Road. "All primary targets secured in transit. Mission complete, Director Vance. Awaiting your return to Boston headquarters." I slid the phone back into my pocket, straightened the cuffs of my Armani suit, and took one final, slow look around the sprawling timber lodge that had cost me everything, yet given me back my true self. The trap was fully sprung. The game was over. And for the first time in 6 long years, the air inside the cabin felt completely, wonderfully clean. The heavy metal doors of the federal transport van slammed shut with a sharp hydraulic thud that echoed off the frozen pine trees surrounding the property, cutting off Sarah's muffled sobs as the convoy of black tactical vehicles began their slow, calculated descent down the snow-choked Ridge Road. Inside the cabin, the silence that rushed back in was absolute, heavy, and profound. The shattered oak front door gaped open to the freezing Vermont wind, allowing a swirling flurry of powdery white snow to drift across the wide planked pine floors, dusting the edges of the ruined dining room where the silver candelabras still flickered weakly against the approaching night. Chapter 10 of my journey wasn't about the dramatic flash of federal handcuffs or the explosive breach of tactical operators. It was about the quiet, agonizing, yet deeply liberating aftermath. The moment the adrenaline fades away, and the true weight of survival settles into the marrow of your bones. I stood motionless beside the long mahogany dining table, resting my fingertips against the polished wood where the stacks of forensic bank ledgers and forged loan documents still lay scattered like autumn leaves. The half-eaten Thanksgiving feast, the roasted turkey, the silver chafing dishes, the crystal goblets of Napa Valley wine, now looked less like a holiday celebration and more like the aftermath of an archaeological dig, unearthing a lost, tragic civilization. For 8 long years, I had inhabited a double life. I had worn the mask of the broken, subservient, chemically poisoned husband, so convincingly that there were times during the darkest winter months when I had nearly forgotten the exact weight of a federal badge, the sharp discipline of the Field Training Division, and the uncompromising clarity of a man whose sole purpose was hunting down white-collar predators. Sarah, Richard, David, and Chloe had assumed they were the master puppeteers pulling my strings, laughing at my supposed cognitive decline, while siphoning millions into offshore accounts. They never suspected that every single stumble, every memory lapse, every nervous twitch and anxious apology had been a meticulously rehearsed performance designed to lure them further and further out onto a fragile limb until the branch finally snapped beneath their collective weight. I walked slowly away from the dining room, my leather-soled shoes clicking rhythmically against the floor, and made my way down the dimly lit hallway toward the master suite. The room was exactly as Sarah had left it in her panic, her expensive winter white blazer draped neatly over the back of an armchair, her international banking logs glowing softly on the open screen of her gold-trimmed laptop resting on the mahogany vanity. I walked over, closed the laptop lid with a quiet snap, and looked at my reflection in the large, ornate gold-framed mirror hanging above the dresser. The man staring back at me didn't look like the defeated, broken-down old man Sarah had tormented for years. The dark circles under my eyes were gone, replaced by the sharp, unyielding gaze of a federal director who had just closed the most complex case of his career. My posture was straight. My navy Armani suit fit impeccably, and my expression carried the cool, unbreakable stillness of a man who had reclaimed his life from the jaws of absolute destruction. I reached up, unpinned my gold executive badge from its concealed leather harness beneath my shirt, and clipped it securely onto my breast pocket where it belonged. The game of shadows was over. The disguise had served its purpose. Now it was time to strip away the remaining debris and begin the arduous, beautiful process of rebuilding from the ashes. 2 hours later, the local Vermont State Police units and federal crime scene investigation teams had completed their initial sweep of the cabin, sealing off the premises with yellow crime scene tape and logging every piece of digital and physical evidence into secure chain of custody containers. The snowstorm outside had finally blown itself out, leaving behind a breathtaking, starlit sky that cast a brilliant silvery luminescence across the silent mountain peaks. I walked out onto the wide front porch, buttoning my heavy wool overcoat against the crisp night air, and stood at the top of the wooden steps where the broken door had once stood. A single federal black sedan idled quietly at the edge of the circular driveway, its exhaust pluming softly into the freezing air. Agent Miller, my second-in-command and the tactical team leader who had coordinated the entire interdiction operation, stepped out from the passenger side of the sedan and walked toward the porch, his boots crunching steadily over the fresh snow. "Everything is locked down and secured, Director," Miller reported crisply, offering a sharp, respectful nod. "All 4 primary suspects have been transferred to the federal holding facility in Burlington without incident. The preliminary asset forfeiture filings have already been transmitted to the district court in Boston, and the offshore accounts linked to Vanguard Holdings have been frozen by the International Banking Commission. Every single dollar they stole is accounted for, and the federal prosecutor is preparing a multi-count indictment that will guarantee no parole for the next 30 years. I looked out across the vast, snow-covered pine forest stretching endlessly beneath the starlight, taking a slow, deep breath of the freezing mountain air that tasted entirely pure, completely untainted by toxic teas, hidden lies, or psychological manipulation. "Good work, Miller," I replied, my voice steady and resonant. "What about the property filings? The secondary mortgages and fraudulent equity liens executed under your forged signature have been officially voided by federal injunction," Miller answered, offering a faint, approving smile. "The cabin and all associated land titles revert entirely back to your personal ownership, clear of any encumbrances. Though, I imagine you won't be spending many weekends up here after everything that's happened." I turned my head back toward the dimly lit interior of the cabin, casting one final lingering look at the sprawling timber lodge that had served as both my prison and my battlefield. "No, Miller," I said quietly. "A house is just wood, stone, and glass. It only becomes a home when there is truth inside its walls. This place served its purpose. Let the federal receivership handle the liquidation. I have no desire to keep the artifacts of a nightmare." Miller nodded understandingly, holding open the rear door of the federal sedan. "Where should we drop you, sir? Boston headquarters? Or your private residence in the city?" I paused for a fraction of a second, feeling a sudden, immense wave of lightness wash over my shoulders, a sensation of total liberation I hadn't felt in over a decade. The corporate world, the endless administrative battles, the suffocating expectations of a life built on compromises and false pretenses. All of it felt distant, irrelevant, and small. "Neither, Miller," I said, stepping off the wooden porch and sliding comfortably into the warm leather interior of the vehicle. "Take me to the airport. I think it's time to take a long, uninterrupted vacation somewhere far away from snow, timber lodges, and corporate balance sheets." A place where the only thing you have to worry about is the rhythm of the ocean and the simple truth of a sunrise. Miller closed the car door gently, walked around to the driver's side, and slid behind the steering wheel. As the sedan shifted into gear and smoothly turned its tires down the winding mountain road, I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching the isolated Vermont cabin recede into the snowy darkness until it disappeared entirely from view. The bitter truths had been uncovered. The toxic illusions had been burned away. And as the vehicle accelerated down toward the highway, carrying me out of the shadows and back into the bright, uncompromised light of reality, I knew that my true journey had finally begun.